British sitcoms gave us some of the most beloved characters in television history, faces that felt like family after years of Sunday night viewing, characters whose voices and catchphrases are still instantly recognizable decades later. But behind 20 of those familiar faces were endings that shocked the country, from sudden collapses on stage, to accidents on film sets, to private battles that never made the papers until it was too late. Before we get into these stories, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because these 20 deaths reveal a side of classic British television that rarely gets talked about, a side that stayed hidden behind the laughter for years in some cases. This is the tragic truth behind 20 of Britain's most beloved sitcom stars, and how they really died. Number 1. Richard Beckinsale. Richard Beckinsale was one of the most promising young actors in British comedy, beloved for playing Lenny Godber in Porridge and Alan Moore in Rising Damp. His warm, easygoing charm made him a favorite with audiences and critics alike, and by his early 30s, he was one of the busiest actors on British television, juggling multiple hit series at once and earning a reputation as one of the most naturally gifted young performers of his generation, someone many colleagues believed was destined for decades more of leading roles, with several biographers later describing his death as one of British television's great what-ifs, wondering openly what heights his career might have reached had he lived another 20 or 30 years. In late 1978, while filming a new sitcom called Bloomers, Beckinsale began experiencing dizzy spells. He saw a doctor who reassured him that the issue was nothing more than an overactive stomach lining and slightly elevated cholesterol. On the 18th of March 1979, he began suffering pain in his chest and arms, but, still trusting his doctor's earlier reassurance, chose not to seek further medical attention that evening. The next day, on the 19th of March 1979, Richard Beckinsale died suddenly of a heart attack, alone at home. He was just 31 years old, and his death sent shockwaves through the British entertainment industry, cutting short a career that had barely begun to reach its full potential. Tributes poured in from castmates and fellow actors who had worked alongside him, many of whom described him as one of the kindest and most genuinely funny people they had ever shared a set with, and several noted that his death made them acutely aware of just how fragile even a seemingly healthy young career could be. Number 2. Leonard Rossiter. Leonard Rossiter built one of the most respected careers in British sitcom history, first as the miserly landlord Rigsby in Rising Damp, and later in the title role of the fall and rise of Reginald Perrin. He was known as a meticulous, energetic performer, rarely ill and known for his physical stamina on stage, someone who took enormous pride in the precision of his comic timing and rehearsed relentlessly to get every beat exactly right, often staying behind after rehearsals to refine small physical details other performers might have overlooked. On the 5th of October 1984, just 16 days before his 58th birthday, Rossiter was performing in Joe Orton's play Loot at the Lyric Theatre in London. About 15 minutes into the performance, he missed his entrance cue. Staff went to check on him and found his dressing room door locked. When they broke it down, they found him unconscious, having suffered a sudden heart attack. He was rushed to hospital but could not be saved, despite the best efforts of paramedics who arrived at the theater within minutes of the alarm being raised. A post-mortem revealed he had been suffering from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a condition in which the heart muscle becomes abnormally thick, making it far harder for the heart to pump blood properly. Despite some recent chest discomfort, doctors had recently examined him and pronounced him fitter than most men his age, which made the suddenness of his death all the more shocking to those who knew him well. Number 3. Arthur Lowe. Arthur Lowe will forever be remembered as Captain Mainwaring, the pompous but ultimately endearing leader of the Home Guard platoon in Dad's Army, a role that made him one of the most quoted actors in British television history. After the show ended in 1977, Lowe continued working steadily in theater and television, remaining one of the most in-demand character actors of his generation, and rarely turning down an opportunity to perform live. On the 14th of April 1982, Lowe collapsed in his dressing room at the Alexandra Theatre in Birmingham, shortly before he was due to go on stage alongside his wife Joan, in a production of Home at 7. He was rushed to Birmingham General Hospital, where doctors determined he had suffered a stroke, working through the night in an effort to stabilize him, though it soon became clear that the stroke had been far too severe to overcome. He passed away early the following morning, on the 15th of April, at the age of 66. The man who had commanded an entire fictional platoon with such comic authority for nearly a decade was gone within hours of stepping toward the stage one final time, a stunningly abrupt end for a performer who had seemed, right up until that evening, to be in perfectly good health, still delivering the same sharp comic performances that had defined his entire career, and showing no outward signs of the underlying condition that would take his life so suddenly, a fact that made the news of his death even harder for colleagues to process at the time. Number 4. John Le Mesurier. John Le Mesurier played Sergeant Wilson in Dad's Army, bringing a laid-back, unflappable charm to a character that contrasted perfectly with Arthur Lowe's blustering Mainwaring. Off-screen, Le Mesurier was known for his relaxed, understated wit and an almost aristocratic calm that made him one of the most beloved figures among his fellow cast members, the kind of performer who never seemed to raise his voice even under pressure, no matter how chaotic a shoot might get around him, a quality that made him a steady, reassuring presence for younger cast members on Dad's Army. In 1977, he collapsed in Australia and was subsequently diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. He lived with the condition for several more years, but on the 15th of November 1983, he died from a stomach hemorrhage brought on by complications of the disease. He was 71 years old. True to character, Le Mesurier had prepared his own death notice in advance, and it was published in the Times the following day. It simply read that he wished it to be known that he had conked out, and that he sadly missed his family and friends. His widow later explained that he found conventional obituary language, with phrases like "slipped away peacefully," genuinely funny, and wanted his own final words to reflect exactly who he was. The notice became instantly famous, still remembered decades later as one of the most quintessentially British death announcements ever published, frequently cited in retrospectives about the actor's dry, understated sense of humor. Number 5. James Beck. James Beck played the black market spiv Private Walker in Dad's Army, a character whose cheeky schemes made him an instant fan favorite from the show's earliest episodes. He was still actively filming the 6th series of the show when tragedy struck, with several of his scenes for that series left unfinished at the time of his sudden hospitalization, requiring the production to quickly adjust its remaining shooting schedule and rework several planned storylines at short notice. While opening a fete in support of guide dogs for the blind, Beck was suddenly taken seriously ill. Within an hour, he was rushed to Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton, suffering from pancreatitis. He remained in hospital for 3 weeks, with colleagues from the show visiting regularly, before dying on the 6th of August 1973, at just 44 years old. His official cause of death was recorded as a combination of heart failure, renal failure, and pancreatitis, a condition that had developed after years of heavy drinking and smoking. His death, in the middle of an ongoing, beloved series, forced the show's writers to quietly retire his character rather than recast the role, leaving Private Walker's story unfinished on screen, just as it was in real life. His castmates, many of whom had grown genuinely close to him over years of filming together, later described his loss as one of the most difficult moments in the show's long history, one that changed the tone on set for the remainder of that series. Number 6. Sid James. Sid James was one of the most familiar faces in British comedy, a carry-on regular, and the star of the sitcom Bless This House. Even in his 60s, James kept up a grueling schedule of live theater work between screen projects, rarely slowing down, often touring provincial theaters with new productions, even while still filming for television back in London, a pace that would have exhausted performers half his age, and one he seemed to genuinely relish rather than resent. On the 26th of April 1976, James was performing in the opening night of a play called The Mating Season at the Sunderland Empire Theatre. Around 20 minutes into the performance, he stopped responding to his fellow actors' dialogue. His co-stars initially thought he might be playing some kind of joke, a pause for comic effect, but they quickly realized something was seriously wrong and called for help from the wings. Sid James had suffered a massive heart attack on stage, in front of a live audience, many of whom did not immediately realize what they were witnessing. He was rushed to Sunderland Royal Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival, the curtain having been brought down abruptly as the theater staff scrambled to get him help, while a stunned audience slowly realized what had actually happened, many of them only fully understanding the gravity of the situation once news reports confirmed his death the next morning. He was 62 years old, and his death, quite literally in the middle of a live performance, remains one of the most talked about moments in British theatre history. Number 7. Yootha Joyce. Yootha Joyce became a household name playing the socially ambitious Mildred Roper in Man About the House, and its spin-off George and Mildred, a role that made her instantly recognizable across the country. Behind the scenes, however, Joyce was struggling badly, privately terrified of being permanently typecast by a character she felt trapped inside, a fear that weighed on her heavily, even as the show continued to bring her greater fame with every new series, fame she often described in interviews as something of a double-edged sword. An inquest into her death later revealed that she had been drinking upward of half a bottle of brandy a day for roughly a decade. On the 24th of August 1980, just 4 days after her 53rd birthday, Yootha Joyce died in hospital from liver failure, having been admitted only a short time before, after her condition rapidly worsened. Her official cause of death was recorded as portal cirrhosis of the liver. Her longtime co-star and close friend, Brian Murphy, was reportedly at her bedside when she passed. A performer whose comic timing had entertained millions had been quietly suffering for years behind one of British television's most popular double acts, her private struggles almost entirely hidden from the audiences who adored her weekly on-screen sparring with Brian Murphy's Mildred-baiting neighbor. Number 8. Wendy Richard. Wendy Richard built two entirely separate legacies in British television. First as the sharp-tongued Miss Brahms in Are You Being Served, and later as the beloved Pauline Fowler in EastEnders, a role she played for more than 2 decades. Her career spanned generations of British viewers, making her one of the most consistently working actresses in the country, with barely a break between the end of one major role and the start of another across more than 3 decades. In 2008, Richard was diagnosed with a third recurrence of breast cancer, after cancer cells were discovered in her left armpit. Further tests revealed that the disease had spread to her left kidney and into her bones, including her spine and ribs. Despite the severity of her diagnosis, she continued working for as long as she was able, determined not to let the illness define the final chapter of a long and celebrated career. Wendy Richard died on the 26th of February 2009, at the Harley Street Clinic where she was being treated, at the age of 65. Just 2 years earlier, in 2007, she had received a Lifetime Achievement Award, a fitting tribute to a career that never really slowed down, even as her health quietly declined behind the scenes, largely unnoticed by the millions of viewers who still watched her every week. Colleagues from both of her signature roles paid tribute to her extraordinary work ethic, noting that she rarely, if ever, discussed the seriousness of her illness with those around her. Number 9. Michael Bates. Michael Bates was a familiar face across several major British sitcoms, playing Cyril Blamire in the early years of Last of the Summer Wine and Rangi Ram in It Ain't Half Hot Mum, a role that made him a favorite of Sunday night audiences throughout the mid-1970s. When Bates was diagnosed with cancer, the disease progressed quickly and painfully. Faced with the impossible choice of which show to continue, he chose to leave Last of the Summer Wine, but insisted on staying with It Ain't Half Hot Mum, working through what those around him described as incredible pain simply because of how much he loved playing the role, a decision that stunned his fellow cast members who had no idea how serious his illness actually was, since he had gone to considerable lengths to keep his diagnosis private from almost everyone on set, applying his own makeup before scenes so nobody would notice how the disease was affecting his skin, a routine he kept up quietly for years without complaint. Michael Bates died on the 11th of January 1978, in Chelsea, London, at the age of 57. His decision to keep performing until almost the very end, despite his condition, became one of the most quietly moving stories among his castmates and colleagues in the years that followed, several of whom only realized the full extent of how much pain he had been hiding once the news of his death broke publicly and details of his final months became more widely known. Number 10. Terry Scott. Terry Scott spent nearly a decade as one half of one of British television's most comfortable and enduring double acts, starring alongside June Whitfield in Terry and June, a gentle domestic sitcom that became a Sunday evening staple for millions of households throughout the early 1980s. In his later years, Scott was diagnosed with cancer, and his health declined steadily despite ongoing treatment. He died at his home in Godalming, Surrey, on the 26th of July 1994, at the age of 67, surrounded by family after a period of declining health that he had largely kept out of the public eye, much as he had kept the details of his career struggles private in earlier decades, preferring always to let his work speak for itself rather than his personal circumstances. His passing marked the end of one of the most recognizable comic partnerships in British sitcom history, and June Whitfield, his co-star for so many years, spoke warmly and often afterward about the close working relationship the two had built over the course of their long-running series together, describing their on-screen chemistry as something that had felt effortless, almost from their very first scene. Have you ever kept watching an old rerun of a show like this, not realizing the actor on screen had already passed away years earlier? It's worth sharing in the comments if one of these deaths caught you completely off guard when you first learned about it. Number 11. Paul Eddington. Paul Eddington built a remarkable dual legacy in British sitcom, playing the mild-mannered Jerry Ledbetter in The Good Life, and later the perpetually frustrated politician Jim Hacker in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, two of the most acclaimed and quoted comedies in British television history. What most viewers never knew was that Eddington had been quietly battling a rare and disfiguring form of skin cancer called mycosis fungoides since the late 1960s. The disease covered his skin in sores and blotches, and he worked hard to keep his condition private for decades, even as cruel tabloid rumors speculated, wrongly, that he was suffering from AIDS. He continued acting throughout his illness, rarely letting audiences see the toll it was taking, applying makeup carefully before filming to conceal the visible effects of the disease from viewers who had no idea what he was privately dealing with. Paul Eddington died on the 4th of November 1995, at the age of 68, having spent nearly 30 years managing a painful, visible illness, almost entirely out of the public eye, while continuing to deliver some of British comedy's most beloved performances. Fellow actors and writers who worked with him later admitted they had no idea how serious his condition truly was until his death was announced. Number 12. Nigel Hawthorne. Nigel Hawthorne played the endlessly scheming civil servant Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister, a performance so precise and so widely admired that it remains one of the defining comic portrayals in British television history. His career reached new heights internationally through both stage and film work in the years that followed, including an Academy Award nomination that brought him a level of global recognition few British sitcom actors of his era ever achieved, even as he remained best remembered at home for his sharp, understated work on Yes Minister, a role he continued to be recognized for wherever he traveled around the world, decades after the series had first gone off the air. In 1995, Hawthorne was outed as gay during the publicity surrounding the Academy Awards, a deeply personal matter that was taken out of his hands and made public without his full control over the narrative. He nonetheless attended the ceremony with his longtime partner, Trevor Bentham, and later spoke openly about his life in his autobiography, choosing to reclaim a story that had initially been told about him without his consent, and gradually turning what had been a painful public moment into an opportunity to speak honestly about his own life. In his final years, Hawthorne privately battled pancreatic cancer for nearly 2 years. Nigel Hawthorne died of a heart attack at his home on the 26th of December 2001, at the age of 72, bringing to a close the life of an actor whose most famous role revolved entirely around the art of concealment, even as his own life had been so publicly exposed. Tributes from across the industry praised both the precision of his acting and the quiet dignity with which he had handled the most difficult, most public moments of his personal life. Number 13. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was one of the defining comic voices of post-war Britain, whose radio series Hancock's Half Hour drew enormous audiences throughout the 1950s and helped shape the format of British sitcom for decades afterward. But Hancock struggled badly with alcoholism and crippling self-doubt throughout much of his adult life, insecurities that worsened, even as his fame grew, and that ultimately drove him to walk away from writers and collaborators who had helped build his earlier success. By 1968, seeking a career revival after several difficult years of declining ratings and personal turmoil, Hancock traveled to Sydney, Australia, to film a new series called Hancock Down Under. Only 3 episodes were completed. On the 25th of June 1968, Tony Hancock took his own life with an overdose of barbiturates washed down with vodka. He left behind a series of increasingly incoherent notes, the last legible one reading simply that things had seemed to go wrong too many times. He was only 44 years old, though those close to him said his body had already been ravaged by years of heavy drinking, a tragic end for one of British comedy's most influential and troubled pioneers. His work continued to influence generations of British comedians long after his death, even as the man behind it never found peace with his own success, a contradiction that biographers and fans alike have spent decades trying to fully understand. Number 14. Harry H. Corbett. Harry H. Corbett spent over a decade playing Harold Steptoe, the perpetually frustrated rag-and-bone man, desperate to escape his father's shadow in Steptoe and Son, a role that made him one of the most recognizable actors on British television throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Corbett suffered his first heart attack in 1979, a warning sign tied in part to his heavy smoking habit, though friends said he found it difficult to slow down given how much he still enjoyed the work. He continued to experience further heart problems over the following years, but kept working through them, determined not to let his health issues slow down a career he had spent decades building from the ground up. On the 21st of March 1982, Harry H. Corbett suffered a fatal heart attack in Hastings, Sussex, having spent the previous few years working through recurring cardiac problems that had already begun taking a visible toll on him. He was 57 years old. He was laid to rest in the churchyard at Penhurst, East Sussex, bringing to an end the story of an actor whose most famous character had spent years desperately trying to build a different future for himself, a wish that, in the end, Corbett himself never quite got the chance to fulfill. Fans of the show often noted the strange, sad parallel between Harold Steptoe's fictional frustrations and the real actor who brought him to life. Number 15. Bob Grant. Bob Grant played bus conductor Jack Harper in On the Buses, one of the most popular British sitcoms of its era, appearing across 74 episodes as well as 3 spin-off feature films between 1969 and 1973. For years, the show made him a familiar and well-loved face across the country, with the character's catchphrases and running gags becoming part of everyday conversation in households up and down Britain, quoted by fans who had never even set foot on a real bus route, a testament to just how deeply the show had embedded itself in the national sense of humor, decades after its original broadcast run had already ended. Away from the cameras, Grant privately struggled with bipolar disorder for many years, a battle that intensified as steady acting work became harder to find once the show ended, leaving him to cope largely on his own without the structure and camaraderie the series had once provided. On the 8th of November 2003, Bob Grant's body was found inside his car in the village of Twining, near Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire, a discovery that came as a profound shock to those who had known him during his years of fame on the show. He was 71 years old. It soon emerged that he had taken his own life. His death served as a quiet, sobering reminder of how difficult life could become for performers once the cameras stopped rolling and the steady work and public attention that had once defined their lives simply disappeared. Friends later spoke of how isolated he had become in his final years, far removed from the busy, high-profile schedule he had once kept during the height of the show's popularity. Number 16. Simon Cadell. Simon Cadell brought a distinctive, classically trained charm to the role of Geoffrey Fairbrother, the reluctant entertainment manager at the center of Hi-de-Hi, one of the most cherished British sitcoms of the 1980s, known for its affectionate send-up of post-war holiday camps. In September 1993, while being treated for pneumonia, doctors discovered that Cadell was suffering from lymphoma. He continued working where he could as his illness progressed, determined to finish out his commitments to the show and its cast for as long as his strength allowed, even as his energy noticeably began to fade between takes. Simon Cadell died in London on the 6th of March, 1996, at just 45 years old. In a strange and painful coincidence, his close friend and fellow actor Jeremy Sinden died of lung cancer only 12 weeks later, meaning the Hi-de-Hi community lost two of its own within the space of just a few months, a devastating stretch for everyone who had worked on the show together. Cast members later described that period as one of the hardest they ever had to navigate, mourning two friends in such rapid succession, and several later admitted the loss changed how they thought about their own health for years afterward. Number 17. Bill Owen. Bill Owen spent an extraordinary 27 years playing the scruffy, endearing Compo in Last of the Summer Wine, becoming so completely associated with the woolly hat and threadbare jacket that the character wore that audiences struggled to picture him any other way. While filming a Millennium special for the show in France, Owen fell seriously ill but insisted on continuing to work despite being in significant pain. Once he returned to England, doctors confirmed he was suffering from pancreatic and bowel cancer. Bill Owen died in Westminster, London, on the 12th of July, 1999, at the age of 85. He was laid to rest in the churchyard of St. John's Parish Church in Upperthong, close to Holmfirth, the real-life Yorkshire town that had served as the beloved backdrop for the show for decades, ensuring that even in death, Owen remained close to the character and the community that had defined his career. Local residents, many of whom had watched him film in their town for years and considered him something close to a neighbor, turned out in large numbers to pay their respects. Number 18. Leonard Pierce. Leonard Pierce played Grandad, the affectionately grumbling elder of the Trotter family, in the very first episodes of Only Fools and Horses, helping establish the warm family dynamic that would go on to define one of the most successful sitcoms in British television history. In early December 1984, Pierce suffered a heart attack and was admitted to Whittington Hospital, where the show's writer, John Sullivan, visited him personally, hopeful at the time that Pierce would recover in time to return to filming. A second, fatal heart attack followed on the 15th of December 1984. Pierce's body was reportedly found at the foot of a flight of stairs. He was 69 years old, and his sudden absence left an unmistakable gap at the heart of a show that was only just beginning to find its audience. His sudden death midway through the show's run forced the writers to incorporate Grandad's passing directly into the storyline, one of the earliest and most memorable examples of a British sitcom addressing the real-life loss of one of its own actors directly within the fiction of the show itself. Uncle Albert, played by Buster Merryfield, took his place in the Trotter household from that point on, a transition the writers handled carefully, given how quickly and unexpectedly they had lost the actor who had helped anchor the show from its very first broadcast. Number 19. Gordon Kaye. Gordon Kaye spent a decade playing the endlessly scheming cafe owner René Artois in Allo Allo, a role that made him one of the most recognizable faces in British comedy throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, and one whose exaggerated French accent, along with his catchphrase about listening very carefully because he would only say something once, became instantly imitable across the country. In January 1990, during a violent storm that battered much of London, a wooden advertising hoarding was blown directly through the windscreen of Kaye's car as he drove home, striking him with tremendous force. The impact caused catastrophic head injuries, and he underwent 5.5 hours of emergency brain surgery to save his life. For a time, the future of the show itself was thrown into serious doubt as Kaye's recovery progressed slowly, and the accident left him with lasting memory problems for the rest of his life. Producers seriously considered recasting the role or ending the series altogether before deciding to wait for him to recover, a decision that ultimately allowed the show to continue on air for several more years once he was well enough to return. He eventually returned to finish out the series. Decades later, Kaye developed dementia, and after a 2-year decline, he died at a care home in North Yorkshire on the 23rd of January 2017, at the age of 75, bringing a quiet close to a life that had already survived one of the most dramatic near-death experiences in British sitcom history, and whose recovery from that accident decades earlier had already been considered remarkable by the doctors who treated him. If a character like Renee or Campo genuinely shaped your sense of humor growing up, we'd love to hear about it in the comments, along with which of these 20 stories hit you the hardest. Number 20. Roy Kinnear. Roy Kinnear was one of British comedy's most reliable and beloved character actors, a familiar face across decades of television and film who brought warmth and comic energy to everything he appeared in, right up until the final days of his career, working steadily in comedy roles for well over 30 years before his death, appearing in everything from stage farces to beloved children's films alongside his television work. In September 1988, while filming The Return of the Musketeers in Toledo, Spain, Kinnear was asked to perform a horse-riding stunt across a slippery cobbled bridge, a sequence the professional stunt team had already refused to attempt due to the dangerous conditions. Kinnear himself had raised serious safety concerns beforehand, having little riding experience, and had specifically requested a stunt double, but none was made available for his part, leaving him with little choice but to attempt the sequence himself, despite having voiced his concerns repeatedly to the director beforehand, concerns that colleagues later confirmed had been raised more than once in the days leading up to the accident, making the outcome feel to many on set like a tragedy that could and should have been prevented. On the 19th of September, he fell from the horse and suffered a broken pelvis. He died from a heart attack the following day in a hospital in Madrid, at the age of 54. His widow later sued the production for negligence and wrongful death, ultimately winning significant compensation, and his death remains one of the most cited cautionary tales in the British film industry about the dangers actors can face when safety concerns go unheard on set. Decades later, his own son became a vocal campaigner for improved safety standards on film productions, citing his father's death as a case that should never have been allowed to happen, and continuing to argue publicly that not enough had changed in the industry even years later, pushing for reforms that he said should have been standard practice long before his father's death. 20 performers, 20 completely different lives, and 20 completely different endings, and yet the same underlying truth runs through every single one of these stories. The characters they played live on forever, in reruns, frozen in time exactly as audiences remember them, while the real people behind those characters face sudden heart attacks, private illnesses, terrible accidents, and struggles that most viewers never knew anything about until the news broke. Some died mid-performance in front of a live audience. Others fought illnesses quietly for years without a single headline. A few never got the chance to grow old at all, their careers and lives cut short at a point when they still had so much more to give. If these stories moved you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one, and let us know in the comments which of these 20 sitcom stars meant the most to you growing up.